Okay, so this video is going to cover the map family of functions from the tidyverse package and a core distinction of this group of functions and why you might want to use it for iteration versus for loops is that this is very useful when you want to do something across multiple columns. I think we've talked in class about how what would you do if you wanted to convert multiple columns to a factor, or if you want to take the mean of multiple columns. So this is the function or family of functions that are useful for that, which is distinctly different from what we were learning about with for loops, which tend to be used more on rows of data. And so the map family functions automatically loads when you load tidyverse because it is within the per package, which is part of the tidyverse family. And so essentially there are a number of functions and they take at their core two arguments. The data that you want to iterate over and the function that you want to use on that data. So we're going to be working with the iris data set again that we were working with in the previous video. And very basically, we can call up the function map and we bring in the data that we want to do something to, and then we write some sort of function. So in this case, let's use mean and calculate the mean of each column. So we can see the output here. We have one value for each column, and we also get a warning message saying NA for species, and that's because those are a bunch of character values, so it's unable to calculate a mean for that column. And so one thing that's important to point out here is that the default output is a list, which we haven't worked too much with lists in our data so far, but sometimes there's a need for that. But there's also a function if you want to spit out a data frame. So say we know we want our output to be a data frame, we can use map_df. And so essentially this takes a data frame in, we can get a data frame out. So let's say iris mean, and we can see it gives us a very familiar looking output of a tibble. And so there are a lot of different map functions that have different, outputs associated with them. So depending on what you want to do, you may use a slight variant of map. And then oftentimes, these functions are, sorry, these map functions are used in conjunction with some sort of custom function that you've written to do something. So last week we learned about how to write your own functions. And so this is going to be kind of taking that principle, but using it with iteration. So let's remember the MT cars data set from the last video. We had in this data set a few different columns. And we also had those row names of different cars, it looks like. So say I want to create my own function that takes two different arguments. And in the function, I want to create a character that puts together the argument X, the character gets Y, and miles per gallon. So this is using that paste function that we learned about with date times last week. Elise spent some time describing what the paste function does. And essentially, it's going to be able to take our two arguments and some text values and put them all together into one character value. So we'll run that function and save it in our environment, and then play around with an additional map function called map to character. And this essentially takes two different inputs, hence the map to, and it spits it out as a character. And so the function piece is where we will put in what we've written here as print underscore mpg, but we need to tell it x and y as the two inputs. So we'll go map to character, and our first input are actually going to be all of these row names in our data, so the different cars, and we can call that up by going row names, empty cars. And if you ever want to check out, okay, what exactly is this function doing, we can always highlight and run and see that this is the values that R is going to interpret when it sees row names, empty cars. And then we also want the MPG to get reflected in our output, and then we can put our function. So when we run this, we get a list of 32 character strings that say exactly what we were expecting them to say. Cool. So one other thing I want to point out here is that we created a specific function called print underscore mpg to do this. But sometimes you may just want to embed what we call an anonymous function, where we just put the function within the map function, and so it's not actually saved anywhere in your environment. So essentially what that looks like is we can copy what I've written on line 71 and replace the print mpg function with actually the text that we've written, the code that we've written for that specific function. And so essentially what it looks like is we have our input 1, row names of empty cars, input 2, empty cars mpg, and then the third argument, which is our actual function, which has the same syntax as we used before, except there's no curly brackets needed in this case. And when we run this code, we can see that the output is the exact same. So this is a nice way of just kind of combining iteration and function writing into one. And so you don't have to track down like, oh, where's that function that I made to do this one thing that I need to run before I can run the map to character function. So in class, we're going to expand upon this a little more and think about how we can kind of create a workflow around having all these very specific coding tasks that we need to get done, and then generalizing them into a function and bringing an iteration to make it very efficient. So stay tuned for that.